At age 62, Mark McGwire remains tied to a glorious chapter that cannot be erased from the history of American baseball, where his power once soared far beyond any ordinary limits. He was the embodiment of pure power, a short, compact, ruthless swing that sent the ball soaring into the sky as if gravity had never existed. With 583 career home runs, Mark McGwire was once the nightmare of every pitcher and the pride of Major League Baseball. The 1998 season etched his name into the collective memory of America, when 70 home runs were not just a record, but a shot of revival for a sport that had just emerged from a devastating strike. Stadiums were packed, kids wore number 25 jerseys, and the media called his name like a symbol of new hope. McGwire was Rookie of the Year, a 12-time All-Star, a World Series champion, and a key figure in shaping an explosive offensive era. In that moment, he was not just a great player, he was the image of American baseball rising from the ruins, a man loved by an entire nation for bringing joy back at the exact right time. But behind those dazzling numbers was a silent pain that stretched across many years, as his body gradually became a battlefield, and his mind became trapped between expectations and fear. The back pain, the leg pain, the days he had to step onto the field in a battered state slowly wore him down bit by bit, while the spotlight allowed no hint of weakness to show. When questions began to arise, public love turned into suspicion, and the man once hailed as a hero had to face a heavy silence. There was no full celebration, no comfortable ending, only a man living with a fractured legacy. But in that very silence, Mark McGwire chose not to run, not to fight back, not to whitewash. He accepted the burden of his past and continued living with it, quietly working, quietly being a father, quietly taking responsibility. His strength no longer lay in breaking more records, but in standing firm every day against history, continuing to exist even knowing he would never be loved the way he once was. If you want to keep exploring the journey behind the spotlight, where Mark McGwire began facing the first cracks of fate, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next part of this story. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next part, where the real tragedy slowly begins to unfold. Mark McGwire's childhood did not begin with poverty or chaos, but with a quiet kind of fullness where material needs were met, yet emotions were rarely named. He grew up in a middle-class family in California, with a strict dentist father and a devoted but reserved mother, in a neat orderly house without explosive anger, but also without many long hugs or gentle affirmations. From a very young age, Mark's body developed far ahead of his peers, taller, stronger, heavier, and that difference quickly became the first thing, sometimes the only thing, others saw in him. At school, on the playground, in youth teams, Mark was praised for his strength, for his long hits, for a body born to play sports, while the tender emotions inside went largely unnoticed. When a child grows faster than his age, the world often forgets that his soul still needs soothing, and Mark learned very early that recognition came from achievement, not from showing feelings. Every time he hit the ball well, the adult's eyes lit up. Every time he failed, silence enveloped him, not scolding, but enough to make him understand he had just lost value. No one said it outright, but the message repeated through every glance, every compliment, every small disappointment: you are only seen when you are strong. Mark was not taught how to name sadness or fear, he was taught to swallow them and keep moving forward. He was not asked, "How do you feel?" but "Can you hit it farther?" Gradually he learned silence as a survival reflex, learned to endure wordless pressure, learned to stand firm while the fragile part inside had nowhere to hold on. His body increasingly became both a shield protecting his soul and the chains binding it. As Mark entered his teenage years, his physical difference made him both celebrated and isolated. People admired his strength, but few truly came close to understand the person he was. That sense of loneliness did not erupt into rebellion or defiance, it settled into quiet resignation. If you want to be loved, keep being strong. If you want to survive, never show weakness. Every practice, every game, every praise reinforced that belief until it became the foundation of how Mark saw himself. His worth was not measured by kindness, sensitivity, or simple joy, but by the weight of his swing and the distance the ball traveled. The seed of tragedy was not planted with tears or obvious wounds, but with the silent absence of emotional connection, and that seed grew over the years, blending into every muscle fiber, every breath, every later decision. When Mark McGwire stepped into the wider world of elite sports, he carried a lesson etched deep into his blood. Only when his body remained strong enough would the man inside still be worth seeing, a belief that seemed simple then, but would later become the heaviest burden of his entire life. The American dream came to Mark McGwire, not in slow steps, but in one explosive leap that left the world around him struggling to catch up. When he stepped into the University of Southern California, Mark was not just an ordinary student-athlete, he was the embodiment of every expectation American college baseball could place on one person. His towering frame, explosive power, swings that made the stands rise early in practice sessions, all quickly turned him into a name spoken as a foregone conclusion for the future. USC was not just a place to hone skills, it was where Mark was placed on the conveyor belt of collective ambition, where every game was seen as a test for the next great heir to American baseball. Praise came in waves, and with it came labels Mark never asked for: the next great American slugger. Then the 1988 Olympics arrived as a historic milestone. Wearing the national colors, Mark McGwire helped Team USA win gold, a moment seen as the final confirmation that every expectation placed on him was entirely justified. To America, he was the symbol of youthful strength, of an open future, of the belief that baseball still had figures big enough to carry its tradition. But for Mark himself, that feeling was not as pure as the cheering crowds. Success arrived too fast for him to build an identity beyond the field. While everyone called him a future legend, Mark was still just a young man trying to figure out who he was without a bat in his hands. Beneath the cheers, a silent fear grew. At USC, at the Olympics, on every field he stepped onto, Mark began to realize a cold truth: talent is loved, but only while it stays fresh. In a system always hunting for the next one, every spot can be replaced, every name can be forgotten if it does not keep surpassing itself. That fear was never spoken, because a man dubbed the future of American baseball is not allowed to tremble. Mark learned to hide the worry behind composure, learned to let his body speak for the unanswered questions in his head. Success came before he could understand who he was, and so it brought not security, but only raised the stakes. At an age when many are still fumbling for direction, Mark McGwire was thrust onto the only path everyone assumed was right. There was little room left to make mistakes, little right to hesitate. Any slowdown could be seen as the first sign of decline. The pressure did not come from criticism, but from the silence behind every success. What about next time? That question followed Mark into the weight room, into sleepless nights, into the feeling that every victory only mattered in the instant it happened. The American dream, in the form of USC and the Olympics, opened a dazzling door for Mark McGwire, but it also closed off other choices he never had time to consider. He was not forced, but swept along, not pushed, but lifted by expectations too high. When people saw a glorious future stretching before him, few noticed that future had never asked Mark if he was ready. And in the very moment called destiny, a quiet paradox took shape. The more he was trusted, the more Mark feared, because he understood that if one day his strength no longer met the expectations, the dream that had arrived too soon could vanish just as quickly. When Mark McGwire set foot in the Oakland Athletics, the American dream was no longer a vague promise. It became a raw, cold, unforgiving reality. Oakland did not wait for him to mature. Oakland needed power, needed wins, needed home runs that could change the game in a single swing. And Mark McGwire delivered immediately. From his very first seasons, he did not just prove he deserved the hype, he surpassed every prediction. His hits were not merely runs, they were declarations of dominance, the sharp crack of bat on ball ringing like proof that a new era had begun. When Mark stepped into the batter's box, the entire stadium seemed to hold its breath, because everyone knew what might come next. Then the Bash brothers were born. Mark McGwire and Jose Canseco, two giant frames, two attacking machines built as the ultimate symbols of late 1980s baseball power. The Oakland A's became the team of pure force, where home runs were no longer rare moments, but something expected every night. The media celebrated them as the embodiment of modern baseball, fierce, masculine, relentless. For Mark, this was a peak that arrived early, too early, where every gaze fixed on him carried near absolute faith. Keep hitting farther, harder, and never stop. In that world, there was no room for hesitation, and even less for weakness. But while the numbers on the stat sheet kept climbing, another battle quietly raged inside his body. The pain began to appear, at first just fatigue after games, then slowly turning into dull knives in his back, his legs, the joints overloaded by a body forced to operate like a machine. Mark did not talk much about it. In Oakland in MLB, pain was something everyone carried, and complaining about it meant questioning your own right to exist. A man paid to produce power is not allowed to say he is hurting. And so Mark learned to suppress it. Painkillers became a familiar companion. Injections appeared as temporary solutions to get through this week, this game, this season. No one asked if he could handle it, because the only question the world around him cared about was how many more home runs he could still hit. Every time his body sent a warning signal, Mark found another reason to stay silent, because in the atmosphere of worship, pain was seen as a kind of personal failure. He did not want to be the one who shattered the image of the invincible Bash Brothers, did not want to become the name that made others question the durability of the power they were so obsessed with. The seasons passed in a whirlwind of success and damage. Home runs still came like a storm, but each swing seemed to take away a small piece of his body's ability to recover. Mark began living in a state of both triumph and fear, because he could feel very clearly that what was bringing him glory was also the very thing wearing him down day by day. But at the peak, no one teaches you how to stop safely. They only teach you how to climb even higher. In the locker room, amid the jokes and outward confidence, Mark grew more and more withdrawn. He was not the type to display pain, and he did not believe anyone truly wanted to hear about it. In Oakland, his value was measured by the distance the ball traveled, not by the hours he had to endure after each game. And when a person is constantly measured by performance, they gradually come to believe that everything else is secondary. The power that was worshipped had lifted Mark McGwire to the top very early, but that very worship made his pain invisible. He was not forced to continue, but expectations bound him tight. He was not required to endure, but he was placed in an environment where enduring was taken for granted. In the brilliant light of the Oakland A's, Mark became the symbol that both the team and the entire sport relied on, while behind that symbol was a man learning to survive by ignoring the signals from his own body. The peak arrived too soon, and with it came the first cracks, silent but irreversible, signaling that the price of power would not stop at temporary pain, but would follow him through the rest of his career. The years that followed were no longer the story of individual home runs, but a series of days when Mark McGwire entered a silent negotiation with his own body. Each season arrived not as a new opportunity, but as a survival gamble, where the reward was remaining in the public's memory, and the price was paid in every muscle fiber, every joint, every unseen night of pain. In MLB, especially for someone already defined by power, there was no concept of resting at the right time. Rest meant doubt. Slowing down meant being replaced, and Mark understood that better than anyone. He had seen names once celebrated disappear after just one bad season. In a world where history is rewritten every year, the greatest fear is not losing a game, it is being forgotten. His body began sending signals that grew more intense, no longer just fleeting pain after a game, but a lingering heaviness, stiffness every time he woke up, the first steps of the day feeling like a challenge. But the schedule did not wait, and his reputation certainly did not allow him to stop. Every time Mark considered resting, the question immediately arose: if I stop, who will take my place? And if that person does better, will there still be room for me when I come back? That pressure needed no reminder. It existed in the air, in the coach's eyes, in the articles praising his tireless strength. Not allowed to rest, not allowed to slow down, Mark began living at an unnatural pace, where his body was forced to follow the timeline of expectations. Painkillers were no longer a temporary measure, they became part of the routine before every game. Injections were not seen as signs of crisis, but as tools to keep working. In the locker room culture of that time, this was not rare, but for Mark, it carried a different meaning. Every dose was an agreement that he would trade his future to hold on to the present. No one forced him to do it, but everything around him made that choice feel almost unavoidable. At the same time, his mental state was quietly neglected. There was no space to talk about the worry, because those around him were living under the same pressure. A man already called a home run machine is not allowed to say he is tired. Mark grew even more silent, retreating into the very image the public demanded he maintain. He no longer played baseball just for joy or competition, but out of fear that if he stopped, everything he had built would vanish. Every swing was not just an effort to score, it was an affirmation that he still had value. It was in that context that steroids began to appear as an idea, not immediately as a clear choice, but as a whisper that grew harder to ignore. When his body kept betraying him, and the pressure refused to let him step back, the thought of something that could help him keep going became haunting. It did not appear as cold cheating, but as a last resort for a man trapped between two fears, the fear of destroying his body, and the fear of being erased from the memory of the sport to which he had given his entire youth. In an environment where many were finding ways to extend their careers at any cost, Mark no longer felt he was outside that current. The most painful thing was not the specific decision, but the feeling that there were no other choices left. When every season felt like it could be the last, when every injury carried the risk of never returning, Mark began to see his career as a countdown clock. He did not want to become a name remembered as once very strong, because for him the past meant being surpassed, and so he kept gambling, kept suppressing the pain, kept believing that if he could just get through one more season, everything would be okay. But the truth is, every gamble leaves consequences. His body broke down little by little, while his mind grew more isolated. Mark McGwire stepped deeper into a path where strength was no longer a gift, but a duty, where survival was no longer a given, but something to be fought for every day. That inescapable pressure did not explode into tragedy right away, but it built like an undercurrent, pushing him closer to the moment when the whole world would look back and wonder, a man who went so far, who endured so much, what is left when the body can no longer carry the expectations history placed on his shoulders? The year 1998 did not unfold like an ordinary season. It was a historic moment prepared to explode, and Mark McGwire stepped into it carrying far too much on his shoulders already. American baseball had still not fully recovered from the strike wound of 1994. Stadiums had been empty, trust had been fractured, and the public still doubted whether this sport could make them fall in love again. Then the home runs started, first sporadically, then in a rush, and finally as a storm. The race between Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa was not just two names competing for a record, it was two locomotives pulling an entire culture that desperately wanted to believe again. Every swing was no longer just a sports action, it was a collective ritual. Every ball that cleared the fence carried not just points, but the relieved sighs of millions. The stands went wild in a way baseball had not seen in years. Kids in number 25 jerseys jumped up with their parents every time Mark stepped into the batter's box, as if witnessing something sacred. Television broadcasts cut regular programming to follow each at-bat. Evening news led with the latest home run count, and major newspapers called McGwire the symbol of a comeback. To the public, he was not just a player, he was proof that baseball could still be pure, could still bring pure joy without explanation. And Mark, with his quiet stance, short answers, and tears after breaking the record, was built up as the perfect moral image for that moment. But behind the endless applause was a truth no one wanted to face head-on. Mark's body at that time was no longer the durable machine the public imagined. Every day on the field was a day he had to convince himself he still had enough strength to step out. The pain did not disappear as the season entered its decisive phase. It grew more intense, demanded more, and forced him to rely on measures he had never thought he would need. But in 1998, stopping was not an option. The whole country was watching him, and no one wanted to hear that the symbol of hope was in pain. The public's frenzy created a cruel paradox. The more he was loved, the more Mark was stripped of the right to be weak. When kids looked at him as a role model, when the media called him the savior of baseball, every sign of fatigue became something that had to be hidden. He was no longer playing for the team or for himself, but because he felt that if he collapsed, this beautiful story would collapse with him. And so Mark continued. day after day, game after game, carrying the deep fear that just one moment of not being strong enough would cost him not only the record, but the faith millions had placed in him. The race with Sammy Sosa, in the public's eyes, was the symbol of pure sportsmanship, of two men pushing each other to new limits, but inside it was relentless pressure. Every time Sosa surged ahead, Mark knew he could not slow down, not out of jealousy, but because the whole world was counting every hit, and any delay was magnified. Scoreboards updated the numbers constantly, and with them came the feeling that time was running out. The peak was no longer a distant goal, it was right in front of him, and at the same time the deepest abyss if he slipped. In those rare moments alone, Mark could clearly feel the contradiction tearing him in two. On one hand, he understood that he was living the dream any player would envy: being loved, being celebrated, having his name written into history. On the other hand, he knew the price he was paying for that dream was exceeding anything he had ever imagined. The dependency was not just physical, it was mental, dependency on the rhythm of victory, on the feeling of being recognized, on the silence of questions that had not yet been asked. And it was that very silence that kept him moving forward, even as everything inside was shaking. When the 62nd home run, then the 70th, was hit, America erupted in collective joy. Mark stood before the stands, tears falling, words of thanks catching in his throat, and that moment was preserved as the perfect image of American sports. But right in that moment, he also understood that he had gone too far to be able to step back easily. The 1998 season did not just lift him to the peak, it locked him into a role he no longer had the right to escape. The role of the man who was not allowed to collapse. The whole country celebrated, but Mark McGwire was not allowed to fall. When the festivities ended, when the newspapers moved on to other stories, he still had to live with the accumulated consequences of every day that had passed. The pain did not vanish with the cheers. The fear did not dissolve under the stadium lights. Instead, they clung tighter, because now he was not just facing a body slowly wearing down, he was facing a public image too large to carry for the rest of his life. 1998 became the emotional peak for an entire nation, but it was also the seed of personal tragedy, where Mark McGwire had traded his own safety to keep the collective dream alive for one more summer. After the summer of 1998, Mark McGwire did not step down from the peak. He was held there, like someone who had climbed too high to turn back safely. The number 70 home runs was not just a record, it became a moral marker, a cultural symbol, a standard that America proudly held up to itself. Mark was no longer seen as a player, he was seen as living proof of purity, of the belief that baseball could overcome its old cracks and return as beautiful as before. Congress mentioned his name in speeches, the president sent congratulations, the media built the story of a humble, soft-spoken hero who let only his bat do the talking. In that moment, Mark McGwire seemed to have touched everything the American dream could promise. But that very outward perfection closed the last door of choice he had. When a person is lifted into an icon, they are no longer allowed to live as an ordinary individual. Every action Mark took was scrutinized under the light of collective expectation. He could not slow down, because slowing down would be interpreted as decline. He could not stop, because stopping would cast doubt on the entire story. Even the pain he carried every day was no longer a private matter, because if it were acknowledged, the perfect image the public needed would begin to crack. And so Mark continued living in a role he had never asked for, but had no way to refuse. The interviews that followed no longer revolved around the joy of playing ball, but around what he would do next to deserve what he had just achieved. Each new season was awaited as a moral test, not just for his playing ability, but for whether Mark could continue to hold the role of icon. He understood very clearly that the record had placed him in a position with no way back. If he played worse, he would be asked why. If he played the same, he would be doubted. And if he played better, that doubt would only grow larger. Success, instead of opening new paths, locked him into a narrow road with no exit. Beneath the calm demeanor the public loved was a fear that grew sharper every day. Mark lived with the feeling that just one spotlight hitting the wrong angle, one question asked at the wrong time, and everything could collapse. Every day that passed was a day he had to weigh every word, every gesture, every moment of silence. The fear of being exposed did not need to be named. It existed like a constant hum, reminding him that the peak he stood on was also the easiest place to fall, and so he no longer lived for the present, he lived to avoid a future he did not dare imagine. Fame, once seen as the deserved reward for years of endurance, gradually turned into shackles. It bound Mark to the image of a man who was not allowed to make mistakes, not allowed to be weak, not allowed to step back to breathe. Every time he stepped outside, the fans' eyes were both admiration and a reminder that he no longer belonged to himself. He belonged to a story America wanted to tell about itself, and that story had no room for complexity. In those rare moments alone, Mark clearly felt the loneliness of being at the top. No one left to ask if he was okay, because everyone assumed that someone who had just set a historic record could not possibly not be okay. Words of encouragement became hollow, because they did not touch what he truly needed, the right to be an imperfect human being. But that right had been traded long ago, the moment he accepted to keep walking the path success had laid out. The years after 1998 were not a gentle continuation of glory, they were a series of days when Mark tried to keep the picture from breaking. He still hit the ball, still appeared in public, still kept the familiar quiet demeanor, but inside was constant tension. Every day he woke up wondering if today would be the day everything changed. No one saw that worry, because he had become too good at hiding it, and it was that very ability to hide that kept him trapped, because the better he hid it, the greater the pressure became. The peak of 1998 was once seen as the most beautiful moment of Mark McGwire's career, but over time, it emerged as a door that closed behind him. From then on, every step was bound by what he had already done, not by what he still wanted to do. Success was no longer something to enjoy. It was something to protect, and in the process of protecting it, Mark gradually lost the last sense of freedom, only to realize that sometimes the greatest tragedy for a person is not failing to reach the peak, but reaching it too soon, too brightly, to the point where there is no way to turn back without bringing the entire collapse along. Mark McGwire's silence was no longer a private choice. When the questions began to move beyond the ball field and into public space, Androstenilin Andro was still legal at the end of the 1990s, openly sold in nutrition stores, but that legality was not enough to dispel the growing unease spreading through American society. After the summer of 1998, when the miracle had happened, America did not just want to celebrate. America wanted to be sure that miracle was done the right way. And when boxes of Andro were found in lockers, when whispers began appearing in newspapers one after another, a small but clear crack formed right in the middle of the perfect picture. Mark understood that. He understood that what had once been seen as legitimate was now being looked at through a different, harsher, more bitter lens. In 2005, when the U.S. Congress held hearings on performance-enhancing substances in baseball, the story was no longer confined to locker rooms or sports pages. It became a national moral issue, where idols were summoned not to receive congratulations, but to answer doubts. Mark walked into that room with his familiar posture, quiet, soft-spoken, seemingly always trying to keep a safe distance between himself and the world. But this time, that distance was no longer accepted. When the lights came on, when the questions were asked, the silence that had once helped him survive suddenly became the thing that hurt. The statement, "I'm not here to talk about the past," rang out like a wall. For Mark, it was the only way to protect himself from a past he did not know how to face in a space that did not allow complexity. But to the public, those words sounded like evasion. The people who once stood to applaud him began to sit down, not out of hatred, but out of disappointment. They had believed in a simple story: strength, effort, and victory. And when that story was questioned, they expected a similarly simple explanation. Instead, they got silence. The public's disappointment did not explode immediately. It spread slowly, like a crack creeping across the surface of glass. Mark was not convicted, not handcuffed, not stripped of the numbers on the stat sheet, but what was damaged was the invisible bond between him and those who had trusted him. The media began to change its tone. Articles that once praised his humility now dissected every answer, every moment of silence, as if they contained something suspicious. The heroic image began to fade, not because of clear evidence, but because of the feeling that something had not been said. For Mark, the days after the hearing were a heavy stretch of time. He did not know what to say to ease the suspicion without pushing himself into an even more dangerous corner. If he said too much, every word would be twisted. If he said too little, the silence would continue to be interpreted as guilt. He chose to remain silent, not because he disrespected the public, but because he saw no safe path through the storm that was forming. But silence, once again, became a double-edged sword. In the eyes of those who once wore number 25 jerseys, who once cheered until their throats were hoarse, Mark was no longer a clear moral exemplar. He became an open question, and in a culture that loves definitive answers, becoming a question is a risky position. People began re-examining the beautiful memories of 1998 under a new, colder light. The collective joy did not disappear, but it was covered with a layer of doubt that made it no longer pure. The most painful thing for Mark was not being doubted. It was the feeling that he had hurt the very people who had once placed their trust in him. He was no longer seen as the savior of baseball, but as the symbol of a more complicated era, where the line between legal and right no longer overlapped. The hero began to be questioned, not because of a specific action being convicted, but because silence was no longer strong enough to hold up a story that had once been told with faith. The public crack did not make Mark McGwire collapse immediately, but it changed forever the way the world looked at him. From then on, whenever his name was mentioned, it no longer stood alone, it came with a question mark. And that question mark, no matter how small, was enough to turn the peak into a more precarious place than ever before. After the hearings and the spreading wave of doubt, Mark McGwire no longer stepped onto the field in the familiar atmosphere of anticipation. The stands were still full, the cheers still rang out, but the name that had once been called like a ritual now appeared less often, more cautiously, as if every time it was spoken it had to be weighed carefully. The fans turning away did not happen in one explosive moment, it happened slowly, quietly, and therefore hurt even more. The eyes that once searched for him in the lineup began drifting to other names, to newer stories that were easier to love. Mark still played, still trained, still stepped into the batter's box with his familiar stance, but the feeling that he was the center of an era was gone. Retirement came to him not like a door opened with applause, but like a long hallway with no one to see him off. There was no grand farewell ceremony, no moment preserved to close things neatly. The decision to stop came as the inevitable result, after years of body and mind being worn down, but that inevitability brought no relief. When Mark left the field, he did not just leave a job, he left the role that had defined him for his entire adult life. And when that role vanished, the emptiness revealed was something nothing could fill. No longer called by name, Mark began facing long days without a schedule, mornings without the sound of cleats on the locker room floor, evenings without stadium lights, only a silence that stretched on until it felt suffocating. In the world of elite sports, where value is tied to presence, disappearing from the stands meant being pushed to the margins of the story. The media quickly found others to talk about. Younger faces, newer records, fresher debates took over the front pages. Mark McGwire's name gradually appeared in the past tense, mentioned like a chapter that had closed, with cautious footnotes. That silence was not like rest. It was a terrifying void, where Mark was forced to face himself without the armor of achievement. Questions postponed for years began to return, not loudly, but persistently. He wondered who he was when no longer measured by the distance of his hits. He wondered if the years of endurance had led to anything beyond a fractured legacy, and above all, he wondered how much his silence had hurt, how many people, including himself. The media, once an ally during the peak years, now became distant. Interviews grew rare, then disappeared. When Mark appeared, the questions no longer revolved around strategy or technique, but around the past, a past he had chosen not to delve into publicly. That avoidance widened the gap between him and the public, and in that gap, empathy slowly faded. Not because people hated him, but because they no longer knew where to place him in their own story. Facing that terrifying emptiness, Mark realized that free fall is not the feeling of a plunge, but the feeling of having nothing to hold on to. When his career ended quietly, he had no climax to close it, only a slow transition into a life he had never prepared for. Old habits became meaningless, old motivations no longer worked, and in that prolonged quiet, the pain did not erupt into grand tragedy, it settled into a persistent, hard-to-name sadness. Mark McGwire had once been accustomed to enduring in brilliant light, but enduring in darkness turned out to be even harder. With no stands to turn toward, no cheers to drown out heavy thoughts, he was forced to live with the silences he had always avoided through the pace of competition. Free fall, for Mark was learning to exist when everything that once held him up had vanished, and in that void, he understood that his hardest battle probably did not take place on the field, but in the months and years afterward, when he had to find meaning again for a life that had once been defined almost entirely by the roar of the crowd, a roar that had now turned its back, leaving him alone with silence stretching to the end. When the seasons had faded into the distance, and the cheers were only memories, Mark McGwire stepped into another phase of his life, not loud, not on stage, but brutal in its own way. The Hall of Fame was not his only dream, but it was where history would officially deliver its final verdict. And there, the votes began to fall like cold sheets of paper, year after year, carrying a short message: not enough. Each voting season passed, his name still appeared, but the percentage never reached the threshold to open the door. No accusations needed, no sentence required, just a number below the line. That was enough to freeze the legacy. The cruelty of the Hall of Fame lies in its quietness. No one stands at a microphone to criticize Mark, no trial, no direct debate, only analyses, columns of numbers, and a long list of those selected without him. Each year, when the list is announced, the baseball world moves on, while Mark stands still once more. No hit to answer with, no game to turn the tide. Here, he is no longer an athlete who can change his fate with one transcendent moment. He is a name dependent on the decisions of others, and that dependence makes everything heavier. What surprises many is not that Mark was rejected, but how he reacted, or rather did not react. He did not fight back, did not launch campaigns, did not write long defenses, he did not beg for sympathy. That silence was not arrogance. It was the exhaustion of a man too accustomed to being forced to explain complex things within frameworks that do not allow complexity to exist. Each vote was not just a number, it was a cut reminding him that what he had accomplished might never be enough for history to fully embrace. Year after year, the story repeated with cold precision. The media discussed, fans argued, analysts compared, while Mark kept his distance. He did not try to rewrite the past, did not try to convince anyone he deserved more than others. To some, that attitude was a sign of acceptance, to others an implicit admission, but to Mark himself, it was the only way to keep living without being crushed by the repeated judgments. The Hall of Fame, for Mark, became a mirror reflecting the complexity of legacy. On one side were undeniable numbers, seasons that changed the entire sport. On the other were doubts that could not be erased. Neither side won completely, and so the door stayed closed. Each time his name appeared, and then vanished from the selected list, it was not just the rejection of an organization, it was a reminder that history is not always fair, but always consistent in its coldness. On announcement days, Mark did not appear before the cameras. He did not stand there for comfort or to argue. That silence came with its price. It widened the gap between him and the public even further, but it also protected him from another cycle of hope followed by disappointment. Each vote was a cut, but each passing year also taught him how to endure one more cut without falling. A frozen legacy does not mean it is erased, it exists in a state of suspension, neither fully affirmed nor completely denied. Mark McGwire lives with that state, understanding that some doors will never open, no matter whether he stays silent or speaks out, and it is precisely in that quiet acceptance that he gradually learns a bitter lesson: some victories cannot be reclaimed, and some judgments cannot be appealed. The Hall of Fame does not call his name, and each time it happens, history quietly turns its back, not in anger but in cold indifference, leaving Mark alone with what he has accomplished and what he will never be fully recognized for. After years of living with silence and cold votes, Mark McGwire entered 2010 as a man who had reached the end of avoidance. There was nothing left to protect, nothing left to reclaim. When he sat down and spoke the truth about steroids, it was not a dramatic moment, not a staged confession to atone or seek sympathy. It happened gently, almost in a whisper, but that very gentleness carried a cruelty heavier than any defense could. Mark did not stand there to argue right or wrong, did not try to explain the context, did not cite pressure or the era. He simply said that he had used steroids, and that was the truth. That confession came too late to change anything in the public eye. The stands had turned away long ago. The Hall of Fame votes had grown accustomed to leaving his name off the list. There was no massive wave of forgiveness, no reversal of history, but Mark seemed to have accepted that before he even spoke. He did not expect redemption, did not expect the doubts to be erased, and certainly did not expect to be welcomed back as a hero. The way he spoke, the way he paused between sentences, showed this was not a last-ditch effort to hold on to fame, but a necessary act so he could continue living without being crushed by what had never been said. The truth, when finally acknowledged, brought no light. It did not make the story prettier, did not make the past easier to accept. It only made everything clearer, and that clarity, for Mark, was a form of release. For many years he had lived in suspension, not fully condemned, not fully trusted. The 2010 confession ended that state. It put a period on the ambiguity, even if that period landed in the most painful place. The public reacted in many ways. Some said it no longer mattered, that the truth came too late to make a difference. Others saw it as the final piece of evidence to close a controversial chapter of baseball. But for Mark, other people's reactions were no longer the center. He had passed the stage of living for the public's gaze. This confession was not for the audience. It was for himself, for the man who had carried that secret through most of his adult life, only to realize that secret had defined him more than any record ever could. There were no tears on television, no moment of collapse. Mark spoke the truth with an almost weary calm, the calm of someone who understood that some consequences cannot be reversed, and the only thing left was to stop running from them. He did not apologize in the way the public expected, did not make a plea for forgiveness. He simply acknowledged, and in that acknowledgement, there was a deep sadness, the sadness of a man who knew that if he had spoken earlier things might have been different, but who also knew that back then, he had not been capable of speaking. The 2010 confession was the peak of tragedy, not because it exposed the truth, but because it confirmed that the truth held no redemptive power. It did not reopen the door to the Hall of Fame, did not restore the heroic image, did not return the lost years, but it did something else, quieter. It freed Mark McGwire from the role he had played for decades. For the first time in a very long while, he no longer had to weigh every answer, no longer had to live in fear of being discovered. The truth came too late to repair the past, but just in time to save the present of one human being. Mark stepped out of 2010, not relieved, but lighter, not fully forgiven, but no longer imprisoned by silence. And perhaps, in that tragedy, that was the only victory left, not a victory over history, or the public, but over himself, the man who had carried too much weight for far too long. After the 2010 confession, Mark McGwire did not enter a dazzling phase of healing as many might imagine. The truth had been spoken, but it brought no miracle to his private life. On the contrary, as the public spotlight gradually dimmed, the personal fragments became clearer than ever. Family, the last refuge, now bore the full marks of years of tension, absence, and prolonged silence. Relationships that had endured too long under the weight of fame, secrets, and endless travel finally grew weary. The marriage did not end in a noisy storm, but in the quiet withdrawal of two people who had drifted too far apart. Mark had once believed that as long as he stayed silent, as long as he fulfilled his role off the field, the family would somehow stay stable. But silence, when prolonged, stops being protection. It becomes distance. Conversations grew shorter, shared evenings became rare exceptions, and eventually, the breakdown was no longer a question of if, but when. When the marriage ended, Mark had no excuses. He understood that some wounds cannot be mended simply by a belated acknowledgement. Being distant from his children was another pain, quiet but deeper. The peak years had taken away something that seemed obvious: presence. Practices, road trips, the pressure to always be ready kept him absent from small but crucial moments: everyday dinners, bedtime questions, times when a father was needed to listen. When he realized that distance, Mark understood that success cannot always compensate for absence, and that lingering regret followed him into silent nights. When all the noise had stopped, Mark's life afterward became more private than ever, no longer seeking cameras, no longer appearing as an icon that needed explaining. He chose slower rhythms, days without schedules, as if relearning how to exist outside the role he had carried for decades. But that quiet was not the same as peace. It was the space where thoughts returned, where the question "what have I done" was no longer drowned out by cheers. In that space, Mark lived with the awareness that he had hurt baseball, not just by his actions, but by the prolonged silence when baseball needed the truth. He no longer argues about right or wrong. He understands that some wounds exist without needing debate. For Mark, the hardest part is not accepting others' judgment, but accepting that an entire summer's collective joy was built on fragile ground. Living with that awareness is a prolonged punishment, one no one needs to impose. Every time he looks back at old images, he no longer just sees balls flying over fences. He sees what was lost along the way: closeness, presence, relationships that were not preserved in time. The silent nights became the real test. No cheers left to cover the unease, no schedule left to delay thoughts. Mark was forced to face emotions he had only ever known how to suppress. There were nights he stayed awake for a long time, not regretting records, but regretting moments he was not there when his family needed him. That regret did not erupt into public tragedy. It settled in persistent, like an old pain that flares up whenever the weather changes. Yet, in those very silent nights, Mark began to learn something new: that a person's worth cannot be measured only by what they accomplished in front of the public. He does not seek loud forgiveness, nor does he try to rewrite the story in his favor. He chooses to live slowly, to repair what can still be repaired in private, and to accept that some cracks will stay with him forever. Mark McGwire's private tragedy has no climax to recount, no neat ending to close. It exists in ordinary days, in quiet dinners, in short but sincere conversations, where he tries to be present, belatedly but genuinely, so the rest of his life does not continue repeating the old losses. After the private breakdowns and prolonged silence, Mark McGwire did not choose to disappear completely from baseball, but he also did not try to return in a blaze of glory. The path he took was far quieter, working as a hitting coach, standing behind young players, in places where the spotlight does not shine. No stage, no applause, no headlines praising him. Just early practices, long afternoons by the batting cage, where the dry, steady crack of ball on bat echoes, and no one asks how he feels. In that role, Mark became almost a shadow. Many know he is there, but few mention his name. When players improve, when long hits make the stands erupt, the praise goes to them, or to the team. Mark steps back one pace, accepting a position without credit. He understands very clearly that this is not a stage for him to reclaim his image. This is where he can continue to contribute without hurting anyone further, where he can give without demanding recognition. Being a hitting coach demands patience and humility, two things Mark learned in the most painful way. He does not teach with grand speeches, does not recount records or past glory. He teaches through small things: how to stay balanced against a tough pitch, how to keep breathing under pressure, how not to let fear stiffen the hands. Those lessons are not just technique, they are life experience drawn from mistakes he does not want the next generation to repeat. Not being praised, not being named, that is not a punishment Mark is forced to endure, but something he actively accepts. After everything, he no longer seeks public acknowledgement. Every time he sees a young player more confident, more composed, he considers that reward enough. There are practices that end with no one noticing when he leaves the field, And it is in that invisibility that Mark finds a new kind of peace, the peace of someone who no longer has to protect an image, no longer has to live as an icon. Passing on skills, for Mark, gradually becomes a quiet way of making amends. He knows no apology can fully erase what happened to baseball, but he also believes that helping make the sport better, cleaner, more sustainable for the next generation is the only thing still within his reach. He encourages young players to listen to their bodies, respect their own limits, and understand that a long career matters more than any dazzling season. Those words of advice are not recorded in the press, but they pass from one person to another, quietly but persistently. Working as a coach in the shadows also means Mark accepts being forgotten once more, but this time the forgetting no longer carries the bitterness of abandonment. It is the price of a conscious choice, the choice not to stand at the center, not to fight for the story, not to demand that history treat him more gently. In that backstage space, Mark McGwire finds another way to stay with baseball, not as a controversial legend, but as a quiet teacher, willing to sacrifice whatever fame remains to give others the chance to do better, go farther, and not carry the burdens he once did. At age 62, Mark McGwire does not wake up each morning waiting for a new verdict from history. That verdict came long ago, repeated through every voting season, every debate that no longer needs his presence. No Hall of Fame, no induction ceremony, no moment standing at a podium hearing his name called amid applause. Mark lives with that reality as something settled, no longer trying to fight it or explain it. He does not argue, because arguing changes nothing. He does not defend, because defending only pulls him back into an old cycle, where the complexity of a human life is forced into black and white questions. Mark's current life is no packed schedule, no stadium lights blazing every night. His days are structured by small, repeated things, as if he is learning to live slowly after a lifetime of being pushed too fast. He focuses on health, on family, on the relationships still strong enough to hold on to. There is no sense of victory, but there is also no more panic, just a heavy acceptance that his legacy is broken, not vanished, but impossible to piece back into a whole. Living with the truth every day is a process without an endpoint. Every time his name is mentioned, whether in a retrospective article or a brief media debate, Mark knows he cannot control the story. He was once so powerful that one swing could change the game. Now he understands that some games cannot be changed by strength. The only thing he can do is not avoid them, not deny them, not paint over them, not demand that history be kinder to him. The loneliness does not disappear when the lights go out, it only changes shape. No longer the loneliness amid cheering crowds, but loneliness in quiet moments, when he sits alone, when memories return uninvited, when old questions echo without anyone asking. Mark does not try to chase them away, he learns to let them stay, as inseparable parts of who he is. Some days that loneliness is heavy, some days it is only a whisper, but it is always there, reminding him that legacy is not just what others remember but what he must carry himself. Not being in the Hall of Fame does not mean having no value, but for Mark, it draws a clear line between official recognition and having to find meaning on his own. He no longer waits for a door to open unexpectedly. He also does not live in bitterness, because that door stayed closed. The dominant emotion now is a persistent sadness, not explosive, the sadness of someone who understands that some consequences cannot be reversed, but that there are still days left to live more decently. At age 62, Mark McGwire does not try to be remembered in any particular way. He does not rewrite his story, does not ask others to see him differently. He simply tries to live so that the days ahead do not continue to hurt what he still cherishes. The loneliness is still there, like an uninvited companion. But in that loneliness, there is a fragile calm. The calm of someone who has stopped running, stopped trying to fix the past, and is learning to exist with a broken legacy, day by day, without glory, without excuses, but also without pretending everything is fine. In this final part, Mark McGwire does not emerge as a redeemed man. No flood of light pours down, no unexpected door in history cracks open, no collective absolution rings from the stands. or from votes that were once cold. He remains exactly where he is, a man who lived fully through both glory and collapse, and now carries it all as an inseparable part of himself. No final victory, no whitewashing, only the truth lying there, heavy but honest. Mark McGwire is not forgiven in the way America often tells stories of fallen heroes who rise again. His story has no perfect arc. When the truth was acknowledged, it did not open a new path. It only closed the last escapes from avoidance. He did not reclaim lost honor, did not enter the Hall of Fame, was not placed by official history in a comfortable frame. But what he did achieve, and perhaps the hardest thing, was to dare to face it. To face his own mistakes without trying to soften them with words, context, or comparisons. That confrontation was not loud. It happened in silence. The same silence Mark had carried since childhood, the one he once used to survive, the one that once hurt others, and that finally became the only space where he could live authentically. Silence now was no longer escape, it was acceptance. Acceptance that some things cannot be fixed, that some losses cannot be restored, and that some questions will forever lack answers that satisfy everyone. Responsibility is what remains clearest in the final chapter of his life. Not legal responsibility, not responsibility to public opinion, but the moral responsibility of a man who once stood at the center of collective faith. Mark lives with the awareness that his actions left cracks in baseball, even though those cracks belong to an era far more complicated than the way it is usually told. He does not deny that. He also does not try to spread the blame to the system, to the culture, to the pressure. For him, responsibility does not need public acknowledgement, it needs to be carried every day. Family becomes the last pillar, imperfect but real, not a place to hide from the past, but a place where he learns to be present in ways he never did before. Quiet dinners, short conversations, ordinary moments no one records, those are the spaces where Mark is no longer an icon, no longer a controversy, no longer a historical case. He is just a father, a husband, a man who has been through too much to still dream of perfection. No final victory also means no comfortable ending for the audience. Mark McGwire's story was not designed to make people feel at ease. It exists as an uncomfortable but necessary reminder that talent does not exempt a person from mistakes, that fame can amplify glory far faster than one individual's capacity to endure it, and that truth, however necessary, is not always accompanied by redemption. The message for America does not lie in condemning or defending Mark McGwire. It lies in acknowledging a more human, more complex, and less comfortable reality. Sometimes the greatest tragedy is not the mistake itself, but having to live the rest of your life with it. Not forgotten, not erased, not rewritten to look prettier, just carried, day by day, with all its consequences. Mark McGwire has not been fully forgiven, but he did something not everyone dares to do. He stopped running from himself. In a world that always demands happy endings, his story closes with a far rawer truth. No glory, no complete atonement, just a man continuing to live, quiet but awake, responsible for what has passed, and accepting that some cracks are not meant to be mended, but to remind us of human limits, and of the real price of reaching the top. The story of Mark McGwire leaves a deep sadness, not because he lost everything, but because he was once given so much and then asked to carry it alone. From the early parts, when a boy was only seen for his physical strength, to the peak of 1998 with 70 home runs, where the entire country placed its faith and its longing for baseball's revival on his shoulders, the tragedy was already planted. McGwire was not just hitting for himself or for the Oakland A's. He was hitting for a nation that needed a beautiful story after the 1994 strike. But because of that, he no longer had the right to be weak, no longer had the right to stop when his body broke down, and the fear of being replaced closed in. When the 2005 congressional hearings, and then the cold Hall of Fame votes appeared, we saw one painful thing clearly. America is very good at building monuments, but also very quick to turn its back when the monument cracks. McGwire chose silence, not because he disdained the public, but because there was no language safe enough to speak the complexity of being human in an era full of performance pressure. The 2010 confession came too late to save his reputation, but just in time to free him from the role he had played for decades. That was not a moment of atonement, it was a moment of taking responsibility. The lesson for the American people from this story does not lie in judging McGwire right or wrong, but in how we treat those who stand at the peak. When a society only celebrates results while ignoring human limits, tragedy is almost inevitable. Sometimes the greatest kindness is not cheering or condemning, but allowing a person to be acknowledged, to be wrong, and to go on living with the truth, even when that truth is never comfortable. Thank you for staying until the end of this sad but very real story about Mark McGwire. If you value the hidden human corners behind the spotlight of sports, please subscribe to the channel to join us on the journeys ahead. See you in the next video, where we continue to listen and reflect on those destinies that reached the peak, but paid the price with an entire lifetime.